Well, welcome everybody to another edition of the Psychomonologues. I'm Dr. Ray Mitch, your host. I'm glad that you took some time out of your busy schedule, summer schedule, to be a part and to listen in. Hopefully there will be things that we talk about that will be of interest to you and encouragement to you as well. Our schedule is going to be pretty irregular through the summer. My schedule, I keep saying our. Partly just because it's summer and we have a variety of trips and things scheduled. There will be an introduction in the next episode to our mascot. It is officially decided, and so we have landed on a candidate who we reviewed the resume and had a number of places of needlepoint puppy teeth in my fingers to prove it. And so I will be introducing him next time, whenever that will be. There will be a reveal, I suppose. There's no accident about his gender, none whatsoever. It is going to be a boy. I am feeling a little bit like the bad old days where I had 4 daughters, 1 wife, and a female golden retriever, and 2 female cats. So I was, as I often say, I was awash in a sea of estrogen. And then we introduced Coda into the mix, and I finally had a male ally. And when things would be developing outside my office door, I would send him out, and he could chart out and recon the area, whether or not it was safe enough for me to come out. And he did that very well. He was a big marshmallow, but it's a big challenge, I think, ultimately, at least for me, to have a new pup on the territory, on the premises here, and a lot of training that goes into that. I'm sure there will be many, many lessons to be learned in doing that with him. So anyway, let me get back to the subject at hand. We have been doing 3 different kind of series. I've been doing them concurrently and sequentially. And so we're back to looking at barriers to God. I want to talk specifically about depression itself, and the pervasiveness of it. Depression is one of these disorders that is so pervasive that a lot of times people have referred to it as the common cold of psychology and psychiatry. But before we get into that, let me introduce, if you're listening for the very first time, the Psych Monologues itself is a podcast that explores the intersection of faith, spiritual formation, and psychology. And it is the voice of Stained Glass International, which is what I already have mentioned to you. The mission for SGI is to equip, encourage, and empower the next generation of Christians to live authentically in relationship to Jesus, others, and themselves. And I'll stop for just a second there. I am reading an extremely interesting book called The Rise of the Modern Self, Rise and Triumph, I believe. And it is very good, but I think probably some people's eyes would glaze over if they were reading it, because there's a fair amount of history to help us understand how we got to where we are today. But all that being said, that what triggered that thought is with themselves, the relationship with Jesus, others, and ourselves, how we view ourselves, is an interesting thing. It's not in a vacuum. It's always in a context, cultural context in particular. So what we're seeking to develop is what I call outposts for the heart, and communities for the soul. Outposts for the heart. Some of the new developments that are on the horizon for SGI will help forward that mission even more intentionally. So that's really the mission of Stained Glass International, and the other part of SGI is sponsoring and leading silent retreats, which I have a special coming up. Takes a fair amount of time in post-production to try to put it all together. I've got 7 or 8 different interviews of people that were a part of our last retreat, and they were kind enough to give me some sound bites from their thoughts on it, common to each one of them, and that allows us to take a look at it. So that's coming up. There's a fair number of fun announcements coming up that I think will hopefully you would keep involved and keep abreast of what is going on here at SGI. So barriers to God and struggling with depression. There are a variety of things here that I think we have to talk about. One of the first ones is the idea of the word depression itself. A lot of times people talk about depression in fairly elastic terms. For somebody like me, and I'm going to be constantly adjusting this mic. I apologize for the video watchers. Depression is the kind of term that seems very elastic. You can say somebody you can talk to and they'll say, I'm depressed today. And whether or not we're following the strict guidelines or criteria for clinical depression, or whether it's a common depression, whether it's discouragement, whether it's feeling blue, it's any number of things that I think fall into that. And that's exactly what muddies the water around that. So what I want to do is kind of describe the topography of depression itself. Parts of it will sound familiar to many of us, myself included. And then some of it won't fit at all, and that's probably the dividing line between common kind of daily, the experience of being human and having losses and dealing with a variety of discouraging events along the way, to actual clinical depression itself. I'm not going to, sit here and try to diagnose anybody. I'm not trying to give you anything that will substitute for a well-placed counseling session with somebody. This is never going to be a substitute for that, partly because it's this intersection that I want to talk about as far as our spiritual development is concerned. But one of the things that I think is most useful to talk about when we're looking at depression is a guy by the name of Dr. Aaron Beck. He is a seminal writer, very well-known writer in depression and the criteria for it for a long time. And maybe if you've gone to a counseling session, your counselor may have given you a inventory called the BDI, the Beck Depression Inventory. And something he mentioned that always has stuck with me that I think helps us understand excuse me, let me take a drink of coffee here, that has always helped me understand depression is something that he refers to as the cognitive triad. And the cognitive triad has, and the word triad it's kind of like triangle or trinity, but it has 3 different elements to it. The first one is directed toward the self, and all of them are negative thought patterns. Now, the thing to keep in mind about depression is that there are different components to it, if you will. There's a thinking component, there is an emotional, affective component to it, and there is a spiritual component to it as well. You can't take one away from the other. They are intertwined and connected. And so when we're talking about this, the negative thoughts about the self would say something like, I'm worthless, I don't have anything to provide society or for people or my relationships. It might be that I'm ugly and no one wants to be my friend. It could be I wish ultimately, I wish that I was just flat out different. And so um, there's always going to be this directed thoughts about self that we cannot really avoid when they're part of depression. Now, the thing to keep in mind is that in a lot of ways, you need all three of these to fall into the larger category of clinical depression. But the self is one. The second one is the world. I'm hopeless because things will never change. It is things can only get worse. The world is against me, and I'm ultimately this second set of thoughts end up being related to some sense of resignation. One of the concepts we often talk about in psychology, at least, is learned helplessness. And over time, we begin to just give up, and there's a resignation that comes with attempts that don't work. Of course, the thing that we don't notice is just the levels of how high the levels are of expectation we have, irrespective of the kinds of things that we're actually going through. And so we don't take that into account at all, and therefore it looks like nothing is ever getting better. The world is against me. The system is against me. Ironically, you can put this even in a cultural context because we have a lot of thought processes culturally that oftentimes blames the system first than the person. So that's the world. And then the last one is negative thoughts about the future. And the future is, I'm hopeless because things will never change. Ultimately, when we start talking about the future, we're talking about prediction. We're saying, I know how this is going to go. I know how the future looks. So in other words, where I am, how I am, the kinds of things that I do are exactly the same way as what they will be in the future in some way. And that's another issue underlying it is if I have all three of these present, I have negative views about myself, the world, and future. The world is against me. The future is black. Things will never get any better. Then why try? And in a lot of cases, what people might say, which I've heard myself say, is what's the point? I mean, why does it matter? Because anything I do doesn't work anyway. And that's a particularly deadly thought that I have certainly struggled with. And so these three are kind of the deadly trinity, if you will, of depression and how they tend to work together or what they look like. And so I think we have to keep that in mind to understand, like I said, kind of the topography. If you're familiar with that term, we use it when you're mountaineering. It's like there are peaks and valleys, and topography is that the differences in different parts of the land that you're trying to traverse. Now, the other thing that we have to take into account when we're talking about depression and why it gets in the way of our relationship with God is a number of distorted thinking patterns. Now, again, what I want to remind you is that when we're talking about depression and we're talking about it the way I'm doing it right now, all the emphasis is on thought patterns, okay? We'll talk later in the podcast. We'll talk a little bit about the emotional component to it, and then also the physiological. You cannot divorce or ignore the physiological substrate that is underneath all of this that goes into and is part of depression. You just can't. And oftentimes we dismiss it because it is so familiar. We don't think anything about it. We have these chemicals flying around in our brain called neurotransmitters. And a lot of times people will ignore the cognitive and the emotional and emphasize the physiological. And they forget about the spiritual part. Okay, so we have medicalized a lot of psych disorders. That doesn't mean to say, let me be clear, that does not mean to say that the physiological or biological component is unimportant. It is very important. At the same time, there are other elements that we have to pay attention to that are equally as important, that you can't be narrow-minded or narrow about what you're looking at. So getting back to where I left off, there are certain distortion patterns, distorted thinking patterns that are also a part of depression. And the very first one is what we call selective abstraction. Again, these things are from Aaron Beck. They're very accessible. You can read them in a variety of places. But this is drawing conclusions on the basis of just what we call in psychology n equals 1, just one instance. There are many, many elements. The thing that we don't take into account when we're sinking into this place of depression is that we have blinders on. And so we end up focusing only on one thing that is most important to us. And when that doesn't work, then we say all is lost. And that's what he talks about in terms of selective abstraction, because then we take one instance and say that's true for every instance. I'm not going to try, because after all, I tried it with this one thing and it didn't work, or one person's side comments or whatever that have actually said something about me or implied something about me. There's a lot of interpretation that goes into and is part of depression as well. So we've got the selective abstraction. The second one is referred to as overgeneralization, and this is making the sweeping conclusions based on a single event. So what you'll notice is that selective abstraction, it's pulling a piece out specifically. And then what overgeneralization does is I take that one specific piece and then I overgeneralize it out to everything. So I have this single event. I go in to have an interview for a job. The job doesn't go well. Why bother? There's no way that this is going to work. It's because it's me. And we get into that kind of spinning, if you will. The third one is magnification, and that's exaggerating the importance of any kind of undesirable thing. So like the example I gave you just a minute ago of going in for an interview, it doesn't work out, it doesn't fit, whatever that might be, and that is now I am a candidate that no one wants. No one's going to want to hire me because this company or this organization didn't hire me. So we have this overgeneralization, we have this selective abstraction, which is pulling out of many things, and then overgeneralizing to everything again, and then the magnification kind of thing where we exaggerate the importance of it. Not that it's unimportant, okay? Let's be clear. Not that it's unimportant, but there's this magnification. And the other thing that's interesting that we tend to do, and these are all used flexibly according to the situation that we find ourselves in, and that's minimization. We minimize things, so underplaying the significance of a positive event. So oftentimes what I say to people sometimes is, so when you succeed, it's an accident, and when you fail, it's because of a character flaw. Something about you. So one is enduring. So when you fail, it's about some characteristic of you that's enduring. When you succeed, it's an accident. It's a one-off, literally. Because if we were to do that with the success that we experience, we could generalize that equally out to a lot of other places if we wanted to, but given the place that we're in, we're not very likely to do that. The other one is the personalization piece. And this is attributing negative attributes or thoughts to others about me. So oftentimes this is contained in a phrase that sometimes I'll use called, if you knew me the way I know me, you wouldn't think that, or you wouldn't say that. Okay. So everything comes through the filter of how I see myself. And so I assume that everybody thinks about me the way I think about me. Now, let me give you a good example of this. I do this. This is the benefit. Let me back up. This is the benefit of a group, because what groups allow somebody like me that's helping people to grow do is that they allow you to do a reality check on these distorted patterns of thinking. And literally this past spring, I did groups. I did two of them, I think. Yeah. Of in my grief and loss class. And grief and loss is not just loss and losing somebody to death. There's a lot more than that. And so oftentimes I will have somebody that is sharing something very vulnerable, very deep with the members of the group. And the interesting thing about it is what we do when we do that is that our eyes look down. We tend to focus on something other than the faces of the people around us. And there are many times, I can't count anymore, that I'd say to the person, wow, that's incredibly vulnerable. Thanks so much for sharing that and trusting us with that. But what do you assume people in the group are going to do with what you said? And the person's still looking down. They're not looking at me. Now, they may look at me because I'm addressing them, but they're just looking down. And they say, well, I'm not willing to even find out because I think that they're going to see me as a monster, or they'll see me as somebody that just can't do life or is not good enough to have friends, or see all of those distorted thinking patterns start showing up. And so I literally will say to them, so why don't you look up and look around? What I want you to do is look up and look around and look in the faces of each person in the group. And it takes a while. It really does take a while. I mean, I think sometimes we're resistant, and that's very much a part of this, is we are resistant to information that's contrary to the assumptions that we make. And so they will finally look up. They'll look at me first because, like I said, I'm addressing them and I'm talking to them. And then they begin to look at the faces of the people around them. And after I'm relatively sure that they have looked at each person, I will say, what do you see? And if they're honest, and a lot of times they are in that moment in time because they're already in this vulnerable place, they're honest that what they say is, I don't see hate. I don't see disgust. I don't see terror. Because a lot of times I think we think of ourselves as monsters, and therefore when people interact with us, they just run away in terror. And I don't see any of that. And that's when I will open up the group and say, well, how do you guys feel about what this person has shared? And they will be so overwhelmingly, lavishly gracious with the person that has shared something so courageously like that. Now, just keep in mind from that perspective, because oftentimes we see somebody else's vulnerability as courage, but we see ours as disgusting. And so we're more than willing to affirm and encourage somebody else's risk-taking like that. But be that as it may, I think it's a bigger part of the landscape of what we're talking about here. So that's a real basic. I'm not giving you any specific diagnostic criteria. I'm talking about a specific area within depression itself, and that is the cognitive area. Cognition has to do with our thoughts and judgments and conclusions and all of those sorts of things. So, and that's a very, very important part. I mean, Paul in, I believe it's in 1 Corinthians, says, I take every thought captive. And that's an amazing statement to make, because it suggests that we can. And so thoughts matter. They frame our world. They not only frame the interior world, but they frame the exterior world as well, including the people that populate it. So let me shift and pivot to the last area, and again, I'm not taking much time to look at the physiology of it. I looked at the cognitive part, but the affective component of it, the emotional, is oftentimes the depressed and discouraged and a dark perspective. And again, you cannot separate out the cognitive from the affective, the emotional. But what are the spiritual implications of this? I mean, what do our spiritual lives have to do with depression, and what role does it actually play? And how is depression actually a barrier? And as ironic as it may sound, we have effectively insulated ourselves from God and others, and alienated ourselves. So I said insulated ourselves from God and others, but alienated ourselves from ourself, because we make the self an object to hate. And so what are the key issues, and what are we insulating ourselves from? Because we're insulating ourselves, just like that example I gave you earlier, we're insulating ourselves from the love of other people and of God himself. Now, I can ask anybody who's depressed to tell me about how God's love for them, and they'll be happy to tell me whatever they want to tell me that is usually true about God's love. But they are the exception. Now, the thing I want to keep in mind, and I'll get to this in a minute, but friends that are trying to support somebody in the middle of depression, oftentimes they go straight to the cognitive component. And like I said, I can ask depressed people all about the love of God, and they will tell me everything about it. Depending on their education and theological background, they would probably go into even bigger discussions about that knowledge that they have, but that knowledge never intersects with what they have grasped, what they have embraced in their hearts themselves. And remember, they are the exception. So we have, in this state that we're in with depression, is that we have effectively insulated ourselves from God's love. One of the key issues that we have to contend with is self-worth, okay? Now, I walk into a minefield here because because in a lot of ways, when I say self-worth, somebody hears self and assumes that that's already corrupted, that's already negative, that's already a bad thing. Except I would remind you of who said, love your neighbor as yourself, which by implication says, if you love yourself, you will love your neighbor. Okay? So self-worth, the question underlying it is, am I worth loving at all, or like God does? And generally the answer is always in the negative. It is always in the negative. But the thing to keep in mind here is that I am evaluating my worth through the various lenses I just described earlier, and I am the final arbiter of my worth, not anyone else, even though I'm happy to use their input, selectively, of course, their input to support my negative view of myself. So if anyone says anything different from what from what I believe about myself, self-worth. Am I worth something? Am I worth loving? Am I worth having a friendship with? All of those things. If someone says something different than that, then they're just being nice. They're just being patronizing. And that could be insulting, of course, when we have such a poor image of ourselves. That insult is well deserved. But what that also means is encouragement is not. And so they're just being nice, or they're just trying to be comforting in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Whatever. There is a way to insulate ourselves from the good that God actually delivers up to us. One of the challenges I had, and this was yesterday, because what is today? Thursday. I'm doing this on Thursday. One of the challenges I had was going to see the litter of puppies that we are evaluating for our candidate to be part of our family. And I have a hard time shifting from saying goodbye to a dog that was part of our family for 16 years to embracing a new one. And because he's different, he's going to be different. And the one thing about dogs is you never have to guess, which is beautiful and disturbing all at the same time, right? Because they love us as we are. They don't know anything about what we should be. We're the only ones that add that. But they love us as we are. And so I find myself wrestling with very similar things that we're talking about here in depression because I have to know the contours of my heart enough to know what the challenge is. And the challenge is just the discomfort, the fear even of investing in another relationship with an animal. Now, you may not be an animal person, that's fine. But animal people know this, is that investing in an animal is a significant relationship part of our lives, and a significant one. But my point where I'm going with this is that hour or so that we spent with the pups was a gift from God. And I saw it as that. It's like, this is so lavishly gracious to interact with these puppies, new life. And God created a creation. He made a creation that was designed for our delight, just like his delight in us. And so that struck me. Because not only it was a part of just interacting with pups, which everybody gets this wonderful endorphin rush from it, but it was also seeing with eyes that understand that the universe that I'm living in is saturated by God, inhabited by God, and he has designed it in such a way that I share in his image of me when I delight in it as it was intended to be. And so there's that part of it, I think, is the self-worth part. The other thing that we have to keep in mind in terms of the thought process and the affective, the emotional process, is the role that shame plays in depression. And I keep coming back to this because this is such a fundamental piece of a lot of what we talk about, and we cannot ignore in our spiritual lives. Henry Nouwen, a very well-known priest that wrote a lot about spiritual formation stuff, made a remarkable statement. He said, the most corrosive element in our spiritual life and formation is self-rejection, otherwise known as shame. And remember the definition of shame. It's this intensely painful feeling or experience of believing that we are so flawed and therefore unworthy of any belonging or acceptance. That's a profound undercurrent. I mean, if you want to talk about riptide emotionally, you're talking about shame, because you get too far out into the waters of relationship or anything else, that riptide will take you and drown you if you're not careful. So the other part of it, I think, that we have to take into account, as I already mentioned, is the physical part. And there's no denying the effect of physiology and the neurotransmitters, the deficits in those, but we're still guessing in a lot of ways. Now, that's not saying it's not worth it, because I have known plenty of people over the course of time that have been so deep in depression that there's got to be something that helps them buy some time to make the changes they need to make. And that's a very strategic, important role that medication plays. Medication just flatly can't be denied. It can't be just dismissed, because in every other area of our lives other than this one, we're more than happy to use medication as far as dealing with pain or dealing with disease or any number of things. So shame has to be accounted for, and it is so familiar to us and so constant that we pay no attention to it at all. So shame is the final one that I think we have to pay attention to. And I think the last thing I want to mention is the difference between knowledge and trust. And I've talked about this in different kinds of contexts, and knowledge and being, or knowledge and whatever else it might be. And there's one thing to know something. There's another thing to trust something. And that is equally true of the love of God and the love of friends and the world that we're in, even though it's so broken, and that makes it dangerous to some degree. It isn't as dangerous as we make it out to be sometimes. That's not to say there aren't significant threats. I am not saying that. Again, I have to qualify all of this because there are conclusions we make so reflexively with some of the things that I can say that I have to try to find a way to head it off of the past. So we have to deal with knowledge and trust. And so if you're a friend and you're trying to walk alongside somebody who's in the midst of depression, don't waste your time trying to convince them to think otherwise. What you offer them is your friendship and your consistency, and dare I say it, your presence says every bit as much as anything you can say that's so profound it will change the way that they think. Quite honestly, all of us know we do not have the power or the control to change how somebody else thinks. But the issue isn't the thinking. The issue is trust. And am I willing to take the hits, if you will, of being misunderstood just because I'm willing to offer my presence? Oftentimes, what my students will walk away with, and I say it so many times that any students out there listening will probably roll their eyes, is something as simple as presence over profundity. Don't try to be profound. Just simply offer your presence. In a lot of cases, we don't think presence is enough. We just don't. And we want to add to it. And usually we don't add to it in ways that is helpful. So we add words. And hopefully you've already gotten the idea that there are plenty of words running around in people's heads anyway. So you don't stand a chance. So even no matter how profound, I mean, think about it. Who is the most profound person you can think of that you've interacted with. And usually any kind of change that has occurred as a result of them has occurred within the context of a relationship with them, which is the presence of them. I mean, think about Jesus and his disciples. He spent 3 years with them, day in and day out, 24/7, and they still didn't get it. And what did he offer them? His presence. He continued to talk. I'm not saying don't talk, but he offered them his presence. And that's when he said the Great Commission and the Great Commandment is, I am with you always to the end of the world. I am with you. Presence. So what's to be done for those of us that struggle with it? And I say us because I am in that number. Is we have to take very small steps in the right direction, not in the opposite direction. Now, we might need some help, which goes to really my first point, and that is we need a support system. We need a group of people that are around us that love us for where we're at and accept us where we are, but they're willing to walk with us to a different place. And I'm not going to say a better place. I'm not going to say, anything like that. Okay. But we need a support system. And that fits right in to the overall mission of SGI because of the outpost groups that I talk about. That's the kind of support system that people that are struggling with the discouragement and depression, maybe of clinical depression, is to have people around them that they're willing to trust and are willing to speak into that darker place that they might be. As a matter of fact, they're willing to engage in the kind of empathy that moves into the prison cell with that person and gives them the strength and talks to them enough to encourage their hearts enough to venture out. And so support system. The other one is just an interesting one. It takes out of Aaron Beck's material and also out of cognitive behavioral therapy, actually, is to conduct experiments to see if the assumptions that we're making are actually true. Excuse me. So when you hear somebody, like I did, say to the person, what do you see? It is that idea is, let's do a reality check on what's flying through your head. And usually it's by the time they have built up enough trust of the person that they're willing to take that risk. And so the last thing I'll say is we need people around us to help us resist the temptation to shame ourselves out of our depression, because you're not using the same tool that got you there is not going to get you out. Okay. And so we need people that are shame resistant. I think that's the phrase that Brené Brown talks about, that have learned the cues, the things that have said what's going on, and they know how to resist it. They know how to resist it, and that's the shame resistant kind of person. So just a few thoughts. I'm sure that there's probably nowhere that I have mentioned in talking through this that people don't necessarily relate to. Everybody does in one point or another. It doesn't mean everyone is depressed. It just means that we go through our ups and downs. That's very typical of human mood, if you will. But there are big dips that people struggle with, and that's where the barrier comes up with God, because love of God, love of others, that's where the challenge is, and the love of self, obviously. So the cognitive triad, the overgeneralization or minimization or selective abstraction, any of those things are part of the distorted thinking pattern. All that is gives you an idea of what it is. It doesn't necessarily help you change it. It's going to be in the context of relationship that will happen. You will not do it isolated, because isolated you will continue to spin on the thoughts and stuff that you've always done, and there's really no new material. There's new reality checking that's going into it. So that's it for today. If you have questions, feel free to DM me on Instagram. I'd be happy to answer them. Follow us on the various social media platforms like Instagram at the Psych Monologues, Facebook at Ray.Mitch, and LinkedIn Dr. Mitch as well. You can subscribe on the website and be able to be updated with new information. There is a feature on the website. I keep mentioning this, and it's a way not only to get information about the relationships that we've been talking about, but it's also a means of supporting SGI. And so the digital devotionals, they come every couple of days. It's called Setting New Boundaries. Excuse me. So every 3 days you will get something. Every 2 days, but every third devotional you will get something on what the problem is, how to address that problem, and then finally how to maintain changes in that with that. And that's what Setting New Boundaries was for. Me and two other friends wrote it many years ago, and I resurrected it to be part of our digital resources within SGI that you can get access to. You can listen to us on any of the platforms, social or the podcast platforms. That includes Spotify, iTunes, Amazon Music, anywhere else. And if you're interested in partnering with us, which would be a godsend, and we would be immensely grateful for it, to grow not only the scholarship fund to allow people to come to the silent retreats, but also just to support the vision and mission of SGI. At the very bottom of the page on drmitch.com, you'll find a donate button. It'll take you to a page you can decide what project to donate to. The silent retreats, SGI kind of general fund, and then we're also raising money to be able to create a vibrant website that people can engage in for resources, for online groups that are secure, and a variety of other aspects to it. So if you prefer to send a physical check, you're more than welcome to do that as well. Just make it out to SGI or Stained Glass International. The address is SGI, P.O. Box 322, Eastlake, Colorado 80614. And so thank you so much for joining me. I pray that it's been encouraging to you. And I will be here next time. I may be joined by somebody next time, so that I'll hang that carrot out there for you all to tune in to the video blog so that you will see who that might be. And until then, love ya. Later. Bye.